In this session, we'll finally address the question that many of you have probably been asking for a very long time. Why haven't we learned about the 10 Sephirot? And since the existence of the 10 Sephirot is without a doubt the most famous concept in Kabbalah, then we should very well wonder why the author chose to begin his summary of the teachings of the Arizal with the concept of the 12 Partzuphim and not with the concept of the 10 Sephirot. But before we'll begin to differentiate between the concept of the 12 Partzuphim and the concept of the 10 Sephirot, you should know that before the Arizal revealed his teachings to his main disciple, Rav Chaim Vital, all the previous Kabbalists described the spiritual worlds mainly in terms of Sephirot and not in terms of Partzuphim. In fact, even Sefer Yetzirah, which dates back almost 4,000 years to the days of Avraham Avinu, speaks about the spiritual worlds in terms of the 10 Sephirot. However, the Arizal began to describe the worlds mainly in terms of the different Partzuphim that the Ein Sof uses to monitor and to govern the world. And in doing so, the Arizal created a revolution of sorts in the mystical Torah world. And now we'll address the question of the hour. What is the difference between the Sephirot and the Partzuphim? In order to understand the subtle difference between these two spiritual concepts, we will describe the 10 Sephirot as the 10 spiritual raw materials from which all the worlds are made of. And according to our parable of these 10 raw materials, we will enumerate the 10 Sephirot in descending order, where the first Sephirah represents the highest grade raw material, while the 10th Sephirah represents the lowest grade raw material. These are the 10 Sephirot. The first and greatest Sephirah is Keter. The second Sephirah is Chokhmah. The third Sephirah is Binah. The fourth Sephirah is Chesed. The fifth Sephirah is Gevurah. The sixth Sephirah is Tiferet. The seventh Sephirah is Netzach. The eighth Sephirah is Hod. The ninth Sephirah is Yesod. And the 10th Sephirah is Malchut. And I assume that many of you have probably heard of the Sephirah called Da'at as well. However, in my humble opinion, this is not the appropriate time to speak about the role of Da'at in respect to the other Sephirot. Therefore, we'll leave that topic on the side for now. Note how I intentionally illustrated the 10 Sephirot organized in a linear fashion, where one Sephirah stands on top of another Sephirah. Also note how each Sephirah stands by itself, without being connected to any other Sephirah. The reason why I illustrated the 10 Sephirot in such a fashion was in order to impress upon you that each single Sephirah is, so to speak, one individual raw material with its very own traits and characteristics that no other Sephirah has. And this is why I also intentionally illustrated each Sephirah in its own particular color, to hammer in the point that every single Sephirah is its very own raw material, independent of all the other Sephirot. But are we really saying that there really isn't any connection between the 10 Sephirot? God forbid, no. After all, we've all seen how the Kabbalists illustrate the 10 Sephirot connected one to the other, similar to what you currently see before you. These are the 10 Sephirot that we enumerated earlier on, beginning with Keter, all the way down to Malchut. However, pay attention to two important details that changed in this current illustration. First, note how the positioning of the 10 Sephirot has changed from the previous linear arrangement. Additionally, note how in this illustration the 10 Sephirot are indeed connected to each other. What you currently see in front of you is actually the organization of the 10 Sephirot in the form of a Partzuf. Indeed, we finally understand that a Partzuf is actually a collection or a formation of 10 private Sephirot who join together to form a more general spiritual entity called a Partzuf. And since the light of the Arizal's teachings began to shine upon the Torah world, the Kabbalists have usually related to God's relationship with the physical world in terms of organic Partzuphim and not just in terms of individual Sephirot. When we carefully inspect the meaning of the term Partzuf, we find that a Partzuf should primarily be understood as a particular measure with which the Almighty relates to our physical world and especially to mankind. But in truth, the term Partzuf is actually an anthropomorphic concept, as human beings also have different Partzufim. And although the term Partzuf could be understood as man's overall appearance, nevertheless, for the purpose of our current discussion, we'll think of a Partzuf specifically as someone's facial expression. And it is no secret that the place where man's mood or behavior is most evident is on his face, i.e., on his Partzuf. After all, when a man behaves in a calm and friendly fashion, more often than not, we can see it on his face, i.e., on his Partzuf. On the other hand, when a person behaves in an angry or revengeful fashion, more often than not, we can see his mood on his face, i.e., on his Partzuf. In truth, you don't have to be an expert in body language to know that every single mood comes along with its familiar set of facial expressions. Based on this anthropomorphic analogy, we will clarify that the same phenomenon applies in the spiritual worlds as well. For example, when the Almighty wants to relate to the physical world and specifically to mankind in a calm and merciful fashion, He does so using the Partzuf known as Arich Anpin. And if you remember, Arich Anpin is the Partzuf which completely suppresses all the dinim. Inasmuch, this is why Arich Anpin is described as an old merciful grandfather with long white hair. On the other hand, when the Almighty wants to relate to us with an angry or revengeful fashion due to our sins, He does so using one of the lower Partzufim, in which the dinim are more pronounced. This is why these lower Partzufim are described as having black hair and even red hair, as the black color and even more so the red color are indicative of the dinim which come down to the world from these lower Partzufim. Having said that, we'll now advance towards an even deeper understanding of the anthropomorphic term called Partzuf. And although till now we've been looking at the Partzufim merely as facial expressions which communicate how the Almighty relates to the physical world, nevertheless, you should note that in truth, the term Partzuf actually relates to the entire appearance of the human body and not just the face. And in case this comparison of the godly measures to the organs of the human body surprises or even shocks you, you should know that this is actually the most central concept discussed in the Kabbalistic literature, as it comes up almost everywhere and in many different facets. Therefore, we too must become acquainted with the fact that most of the mystical literature describes the various godly measures as a spiritual man, so to speak, which is comprised of spiritual organs that carry the same names as our own physical organs. But perhaps the secret is most clearly expressed in the Zohar, in the famous passage known as Patach Eliyahu, where Eliyahu Navi spells out how every single Sephirah represents one spiritual organ, which is compatible with one of our physical organs. According to that, Eliyahu Navi proceeds to clarify that the Sephirah called Keter relates to the skull. The Sephirah called Chokhmah relates to the right brain. The Sephirah called Binah relates to the left brain. The Sephirah called Chesed relates to the right arm. The Sephirah called Gevurah relates to the left arm. The Sephirah called Tiferet relates to the main part of the body, which is the torso. The Sephirah called Netzach relates to the right leg. The Sephirah called Hod relates to the left leg. The Sephirah called Yesod relates to the reproductive organ, i.e. the Brit. Finally, the Sephirah called Malchut relates to the crown on top of the Brit, which is the area from which the foreskin, i.e. the Orla, is removed during the act of circumcision. In truth, there is much to say about the 10 Sephirot and their intimate relationship with the physical makeup of human beings. However, my foremost intention at this stage of our learning is to clarify the fine difference between the concept of Sephirot and the concept of Partzuphim. Therefore, till now, I've been directing our discussion towards attaining a deep appreciation that a Partzuf is actually a combination of 10 private Sephirot, much like the way our human body is a combination of several private organs. Having said that, we can begin to understand why the author of Chasdei David began his summary of the Arizal's teachings by speaking about the 12 Partzufim that were formed in each world by the light of Rachamim that returned into the Halal via the Kav. After all, since the Partzufim are organized in a fashion that relates to man's own physical appearance, the author naturally preferred to open his discussion with the 12 Partzufim. But certainly the 10 Sephirot were also emanated by the same light of Rachamim that flows inside the Kav, even though the author did not spell it out. And now that we've learned how the 10 Sephirot are, so to speak, the spiritual raw materials from which all the Partzufim were formed, I thought that perhaps we could compare the relationship between the Sephirot and the Partzuphim to another famous relationship that we find in our physical world between the physical raw materials and what's made out of them. What aspect of our physical world am I referring to? It is no secret that, generally speaking, it is customary to view the different atoms as the most basic raw materials in our physical world, without getting into details such as quarks, etc. Inasmuch, we have one physical raw material called gold, and another physical raw material called iron, and another one called chlorine, and so on and so on. And as you know, it is customary to organize all of the different physical elements in the famous periodic table as you see in front of you. And according to this train of thought, i.e., when we look at the different atomic elements as the basic raw materials that make up the physical world, we can now proceed to apply this allegorical phenomenon to the spiritual worlds as well. How so? By training ourselves to view the 10 Sephirot as different raw materials that are, so to speak, placed on the Almighty's working table, waiting to be used as needed. This is why we previously illustrated the 10 Sephirot as 10 individual materials sitting one on top of the other in a linear fashion. In the same way that in the periodic table there is no connection between one atomic element and the next, which is why each element sits in its very own separate box, so is also the case with our initial understanding of the 10 Sephirot, who, so to speak, sit by themselves without any connection to the other. However, that is our understanding only when we look at the 10 Sephirot as 10 spiritual raw materials independent of each other. But when these 10 raw materials combine together in an organized fashion which is called a Partzuf, that combination could be compared to when the various atomic elements join together to form a molecule. As you see in front of you, a diagram of a complicated molecule comprised of different elements. However, virtually our entire Kabbalistic heritage from Har Sinai is transmitted from generation to generation by means of parables taken from our physical world. And when you think about it, it shouldn't be hard to understand that our physical mind certainly cannot grasp the real essence of the 10 Sephirot. In fact, this is why Sefer Yetzirah remarks about the 10 Sephirot, Eser Sephirot Belima. That is to say, the 10 Sephirot have no ma, short for no mahut, i.e. no essence. And certainly, the intention of that statement is meant to impress upon us that the 10 Sephirot, and the entire spiritual realm for that matter, are made of an essence that is completely beyond our grasp, for the reason that we are physical creatures with a physical brain that is completely unable to grasp the true essence of the spiritual worlds. Inasmuch, we must therefore rely upon the many parables that the Kabbalists have, so to speak, borrowed from our physical world in order to give us at least some understanding of the spiritual realm that contains these far-fetched Sephirot and Partzuphim.